November 19th, 1941. Mid-afternoon, off the coast of Western Australia, the Indian Ocean was vast, sparkling, and deceptively peaceful. This was not the chaotic North Atlantic or the volatile Mediterranean. This was home water for the Australian fleet, and sailing here was usually a matter of routine and confidence. At the heart of that confidence was His Majesty's Australian ship, HMAS Sydney. She was quite simply the pride of the nation, a sleek, powerful, modified Leander-class light cruiser. The Sydney had already earned her battle honours in the Mediterranean, dispatching the Italian cruiser Bartolomeo Colleoni and cementing her reputation as a lucky, fast, and deadly ship. Her captain, Captain Joseph Burnett, was a respected, experienced commander, and her crew of 645 men were veterans of war, enjoying a relatively quiet tour, protecting the vital convoy routes supplying the Allied war effort. For the crew, this patrol was merely a formality before returning to base. The confidence surrounding the Sydney was so profound that her loss was, until it happened, utterly unthinkable. Australia was, by late 1941, still largely untouched by the direct brutality of the war, and the Sydney was a symbolic shield. Her presence alone reassured a nation far removed from the primary fighting fronts. That sense of safety was about to be shattered in one of the most mysterious and brutal naval encounters of the entire conflict. At approximately 4 p.m., the Sydney spotted a merchant vessel on the horizon, about 120 miles west of Shark Bay. The sighting itself was not unusual, but the behavior of the ship was. The vessel was a freighter, flying the colors of the Dutch merchant marine, and identified as the SS Strat Malacca. However, it was traveling alone and seemed to be attempting a strange, almost nervous maneuver, trying to skirt away from the cruiser's path. Following standard naval procedure, and in a theater known for German auxiliary raiders disguised as merchant ships, Captain Burnett ordered the Sydney to close the range for identification. This was a mandatory, necessary protocol, but one that contained a fatal strategic error. Burnett closed the range too quickly and too closely. As the Sydney drew parallel to the merchant ship, now only about 1,000 meters away, a dangerously close distance in naval terms, the tension grew. Burnett used signal lamps and flags to demand the ship identify itself, but the Dutch vessel's response was delayed and hesitant. The crew of the Sydney could see the shape of the supposed merchant vessel, the name Strat Malacca clearly painted on its bow, but something felt wrong. The vessel looked worn, perhaps too much so. Burnett held his position, keeping the Sydney's superior guns pointed directly at the freighter, but he was inside the fatal minimum range for a fast cruiser, a range where the disguised vessel's smaller, hidden guns could inflict the most catastrophic damage. Then, the terrifying reality exploded. The seemingly innocent Dutch freighter was not Dutch at all. It was the German auxiliary cruiser, HSK Kormoran, commanded by Captain Theodor Detmers. The Kormoran was a deadly wolf in sheep's clothing, a heavily armed raider disguised as a civilian vessel, with 6 150mm guns concealed behind retractable panels, torpedo tubes hidden beneath the waterline, and a devastating array of anti-aircraft guns. With the Sydney positioned almost alongside, fully visible, and dangerously close, Captain Detmers gave the chilling command, "Open fire!" In a matter of seconds, the Cormoran's disguise panels retracted, and the ship unleashed a devastating, coordinated barrage of fire. The German attack was brutal, simultaneous, and aimed at the Sydney's most vulnerable points. The initial salvo, a precise, simultaneous burst of 4 150mm shells and 2 torpedoes, hit the Sydney with catastrophic effect. One shell ripped through the cruiser's bridge, instantly killing Captain Burnett and much of the command staff. Another shell destroyed the Sydney's central fire control system and its aircraft catapult, crippling its intelligence and targeting capability. The two torpedoes aimed at the Sydney missed, but the damage inflicted by the close-range shell fire was already irreversible. The pride of the Australian fleet, the lucky ship, was instantly reduced to a burning, crippled wreck. The brutal, close-range battle that defied all naval convention had just begun. November 19th, 1941, 17:30 hours, 120 miles off Shark Bay, Western Australia. The initial surprise attack by the Kormoran was devastating, but the HMAS Sydney, despite being critically wounded, was far from dead. The close-range German salvo had ripped away the cruiser's command structure and crippled its fire control, leaving the ship essentially blind. However, the 645 men aboard the Sydney were veterans, trained for chaos, and they fought back with the instinctive fury of cornered predators. Even without centralized direction, the Sydney's massive guns roared to life. The surviving officers and gun crews quickly switched to local control, manually aiming and firing the formidable 6-inch guns. The battle instantly devolved into a desperate, brutal, close-range brawl. A gunnery duel fought at a mere 1,000 meters, a distance virtually unheard of for modern cruisers designed to fight over the horizon. The Sydney's A turret, forward main gun, was put out of action almost immediately by German fire, but the B turret and the rear X and Y turrets found their range. The Australian shells, large and heavy, began to tear into the disguised German raider. The Kormoran's disguise, the thin metal panels and paint, offered no protection against the cruiser's heavy ordnance. The Kormoran, an armed merchant ship, was structurally inferior to the purpose-built warship it was fighting, and the Sydney's shells ripped through its hull and superstructure. The German raider quickly began to burn fiercely. One critical Australian shell struck the Kormoran's engine room, crippling its mobility. Another shell landed catastrophically in the raider's fuel tanks, igniting a massive, uncontrolled fire. Captain Detmers and his crew, despite their brilliant initial ambush, now found themselves trapped in a burning, immobilized ship, facing the full fury of a wounded, desperate cruiser. The mutual destruction was rapid and complete. The Kormoran, realizing it was doomed, fired its final, desperate salvo. The German gunners, still operating with chilling efficiency, managed to land another critical hit on the Sydney. One shell exploded near the forward funnel, causing immense internal damage and, most critically, igniting the cruiser's stored aircraft fuel, turning the midsection of the Sydney into a blazing, uncontrollable inferno. Simultaneously, the Kormoran, unable to maneuver, managed to fire its last operational torpedo. The powerful German torpedo struck the Sydney near its bow, ripping a massive hole in the hull, sealing the cruiser's fate. The pride of the Australian fleet was listing, burning from stem to stern, and fatally holed. Despite the mortal blow, the Sydney managed to pull away from the German raider, its remaining aft guns firing wildly into the distance as the ship staggered south, smoke and fire masking its movement. The ship was utterly defeated, its internal communications destroyed, and its decks a charnel house of fire and shredded metal. On the Kormoran, the situation was equally catastrophic. The raider was a burning hulk, immobilized and suffering from massive internal damage. The order to scuttle, to intentionally sink the ship, was given by Captain Detmers. The German crew, prioritizing their survival, began abandoning the crippled vessel, ensuring that the evidence of their clandestine mission would sink to the bottom of the ocean. The battle was over, a brutal, short exchange of fire that had consumed both ships. As darkness fell, the Australian warship, the HMAS Sydney, disappeared over the horizon. a massive column of smoke and sporadic flares marking its last known location. The German survivors, scrambling onto life rafts and into the rough Indian Ocean, watched as the Kormoran, having served its purpose as a disguise and a trap, was destroyed by internal scuttling charges. Detmers and his men had won a tactical victory. They had destroyed the mighty Sydney, but they were now hundreds of miles from land, adrift in the open ocean, the only living witnesses to a battle that defied all conventional naval logic. The Sydney had vanished, taking its entire crew of 645 hands with it, leaving behind only the terrifying silence of the sea and the testimony of its shocked German adversary. Late November 1941, Fremantle, Western Australia, and Naval Headquarters, Melbourne. The silence was the worst part. Days passed after the last official radio signal from HMAS Sydney, a communication that confirmed the cruiser was investigating an unknown merchant vessel off the Western Australian coast. Initially, there was no panic. The Sydney was the fastest, luckiest, and most celebrated ship in the Royal Australian Navy. It had a battle-tested crew and formidable firepower. A routine investigation should have posed no threat. Yet, as the calendar pages turned into the third week of November, the silence grew heavy, turning confidence into a gnawing, national dread. The Naval Command in Melbourne, accustomed to the immediate reporting of any engagement, began the agonizing process of a full-scale search. Vessels were diverted, and patrol aircraft were sent out over the vast, empty expanse of the Indian Ocean, sweeping the last known coordinates of the cruiser. They searched for a sign of the German raider that was almost certainly involved, or, hopefully, the damaged but still functional Sydney, limping home. What they found, day after day, was nothing but endless blue ocean. The ship, with all 645 hands aboard, had simply vanished, completely defying all logic and naval convention. The sense of unease spread across Australia, an entire nation holding its breath, praying that the pride of their fleet would suddenly reappear. Then, on November 24th, the mystery broke. But the news was not the comfort they sought. It was a devastating revelation. A small group of life rafts, carrying 118 exhausted and heavily injured men, drifted ashore near the coast of Western Australia. These were the survivors of the German raider, the HSK Kormoran. The survivors were immediately taken into custody. Their appearance was one of utter defeat. They were burned, wounded, and suffering from exposure. The Australians, driven by a desperate need for answers, began interrogating the senior German officers, including Captain Theodor Detmers, the commander of the Kormoran. The German account of the battle was horrifying, shocking the Australian Naval Command in its brutal simplicity. The narrative described a calculated ambush, how the Kormoran, disguised as the Dutch merchant ship Strat Malacca, lured the Sydney into a dangerously close range, a tactical blunder that should never have happened. The German report detailed the sudden, devastating opening salvo, the destruction of the Sydney's bridge and fire control, and the ensuing close-quarters bloodbath. Fought at a range of less than 1,000 meters. They confessed to firing all their guns and at least one torpedo, confirming the immediate, catastrophic damage to the Australian cruiser. The psychological impact of this testimony was profound. The Australians had expected to hear of a brilliant, distant naval duel, perhaps culminating in the surrender of the raider. Instead, they were told of a merciless, close-range execution. Captain Detmers emphasized that the Sydney had been left a blazing wreck, its forward structure engulfed in fire, its bow badly damaged by a torpedo, and its guns firing sporadically as it limped away into the darkness. But the most chilling detail was that the Kormoran itself was doomed. The German raider had been so severely mauled by the Sydney's counterfire, its engine room destroyed and its fuel tanks on fire, that Detmers had given the order to scuttle the ship. The Australian command faced an impossible, agonizing truth. The lucky cruiser had been destroyed by a mere auxiliary raider, and while more than 300 German sailors survived, the Sydney had yielded 0 survivors. The complete and total disappearance of a first-class warship with all 645 crew members was unheard of. The German testimony was scrutinized, re-examined, and cross-referenced with the smaller groups of German survivors found days later. Despite minor inconsistencies, the core story of the brutal, close-range, mutual destruction remained unshakable. The pride of the Australian fleet had been lost not to a grand enemy fleet, but to a deception and a single tactical error in judgment. Australia's greatest naval mystery had begun its agonizing, long existence. December 1941 to 2008, the Indian Ocean and Australian collective memory. The immediate aftermath of the battle was marked by an excruciating national trauma. While the German survivors of the Kormoran were quickly captured and interned, becoming the only living witnesses to the catastrophe, the entire crew of the HMAS Sydney, 645 men, had vanished. No distress calls were received after the initial contact, and despite extensive searches, not a single lifeboat, life raft, or surviving sailor from the Sydney was ever found. This complete and utter silence created a decades-long void in Australia's collective memory, fueling endless conspiracy theories and accusations that the German survivors had fabricated or embellished their account to conceal a war crime. The German testimony, though detailed and consistent, was met with deep skepticism, driven by the nation's agonizing need to believe that their beloved, battle-hardened cruiser could not have been destroyed by a mere disguised merchant ship. The official inquiry and subsequent military reports confirmed the probability of the German version of events. But without the physical evidence of the Sydney's wreck, doubt lingered like a corrosive fog. The mystery surrounding the loss of all hands became Australia's most profound naval tragedy, a wound that never fully healed. For decades, families of the lost sailors lived with uncertainty, unable to truly reconcile the victorious legend of the Sydney with its sudden, unexplained demise. The Sydney represented not just a ship, but the sacrifice of an entire generation, a sacrifice that lacked a final, physical resting place. The nation needed closure, not just for the families, but for its own historical record. The search for the wreck became an enduring obsession, driven by historians, naval experts, and the families of the fallen. Numerous costly expeditions were mounted over the years, all aimed at locating the deep-sea grave of the cruiser and definitively proving or disproving the German claims. The search area, based primarily on the German survivor testimonies, covered a massive, deep stretch of the Indian Ocean, a testament to the difficulty of locating a piece of metal at great depths. For decades, the ocean kept it secret, only deepening the mystery and the lingering suspicion of German deception. The final, definitive revelation arrived in March 2008. A privately funded expedition finally succeeded in locating the wreck of the HMAS Sydney at a depth of approximately 2,500 meters, exactly where the German survivors had indicated. The sight was sobering. The video footage from the wreck confirmed the devastating accuracy of the Kormoran's fire. The Sydney was found listing heavily, its bow section, where the German torpedo had struck, horribly distorted. Most significantly, the entire bridge and fire control section were found to be completely obliterated by the initial, close-range salvo, proving that the ship had lost its command structure in the opening seconds of the fight. The German account of a crippling, close-range engagement, the ambush that defied all naval rules, was unequivocally confirmed. The location of the Sydney was followed just days later by the discovery of the wreck of the Kormoran, lying only 12 nautical miles away. The juxtaposition of the two wrecks, the powerful cruiser and the disguised raider, resting side by side, perfectly memorialized the concept of mutual destruction. The tragedy was not one of cowardice or deception, but one of a fatal tactical error leading to a sudden, merciless duel that neither ship could survive. The finding brought a painful but necessary closure to Australia, confirming the bravery of the Sydney's crew who fought back with distinction despite being mortally wounded from the very first minute. The loss remains Australia's greatest naval tragedy, but the discovery of the wreck finally affirmed the honor and courage of the 645 hands lost at sea. The tragedy of the HMAS Sydney remains a powerful reminder that in war, a calculated deception can overcome superior force. It took nearly 70 years to find the truth, but the story is now complete. If this incredible story of a vanished warship and a decades-long mystery resonated with you, please hit the like button and share this video with someone who loves naval history. And tell us this, do you agree that Captain Burnett's decision to close the range was the critical error, or was the Kormoran's disguise too perfect to defeat? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the enduring mysteries and untold sagas of military history.